You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in.
a Mamamia podcast.
How does a fiercely intelligent, driven, capable, hardworking, passionate and talented young doctor end up in a mental hospital? Burnt out, broken, disillusioned, unemployed. My name is Mia Friedman and you're listening to No Filter, an interview podcast from Mamamia with people who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. Any no-go areas?
No, anything is fine.
Anything is
This
fine.
is perfect because I don't have a filter.
Same.
Ask me whatever.
I know, I'm so excited. Yumiko Kadota had always dreamed of being a doctor, and it happened. She made it happen. And at first, she thrived in the high-pressure, high-performance environment of the public hospital system, until she didn't. It culminated in a total breakdown, at which point Yumiko had no choice but to resign. On her way out, though, she wrote a searing, emotional blog post that gave an inside account of how a broken system was breaking young doctors, and it went viral. So what went wrong? How is she now? I started our conversation by asking Yumiko to read that post. Here she is.
On the 1st of June, I resigned. It wasn't okay anymore. I was physically alive, but spiritually broken. At lunchtime, I begged the head of department if I could go home. The answer, as always, was no. Just hang in there. I felt like I had already hung in there for 3 months. The 1st of June was my 24th consecutive day of work, 19 of which were 24-hour on-call days. I knew what it would mean to resign. I would be blacklisted and I would never get a job in plastic surgery again in Sydney. But I couldn't keep going. I crashed my car on my way home. At the news of my resignation, the head of department rang me. "Can't you just finish your term? It's only a few more months," said the voice down the line. "I don't think I can," I said. "It's a shame. You have good hands, you're good at what you do, but if you can't handle the hours, maybe this isn't for you." And that was that. The chilling final words from my head of department. I never thought I would say this, but I broke. I give up. I am done. I surrender. I am handing back my dream of becoming a surgeon. I have nothing left to give. I don't want it anymore. I've lost my ambition. I've lost my spark. I started 2018 with optimism and zest. This year would be my year. I would apply for the advanced training program for plastic and reconstructive surgery. I've done the hard yards. I'm good at what I do, and I have the right intentions. Fast forward to October, and I find myself in a hospital bed, barely able to speak or move. If I wasn't so resilient, maybe I wouldn't have put up with the abuse for as long as I did. But I did. And all I can do now is focus on what I can do now to get myself back to my former bouncy self.
Yumiko, are you back to your former bouncy self?
Oh, I'm nearly there. Nearly there. It's taken a bloody long time. I quit my job 3 years ago now, nearly. And I'd say that I'm mostly back.
It's just like Grey's Anatomy, isn't it?
A little bit
Working
like
in
that.
hospital.
Yeah.
I grew up watching ER. I don't know if you grew up watching Grey's Anatomy.
Well, both. I love Mark Green from ER and I love Grey's.
So is that kind of what you thought a hospital would be like?
Yeah, a little bit.
Because
Yeah.
it's what I still kind of imagine. I mean, you know, I know it's a show, but
Yeah. I mean, Grey's Anatomy, I have to say, it's pretty accurate. I love that show. I even learnt a few medical tips from there. So it's pretty accurate. Yeah, even the relationships, the incestuous things that go on, that happens too.
really,
Yeah.
there are some things that aren't shown in Grey's Anatomy though that I learnt by reading your book. I want to start with the first day that you got to do an operation, that you got to be a surgeon and cut into someone. What was that like?
I don't want to sound morbid, I like cutting people, but no, it was exhilarating. I mean, I'd worked so hard to get to that point, and I still remember the first case I got to do in theatre on my own, the level of responsibility.
What was it? What was that day like?
It was actually just like popping a glorified pimple because it was an abscess, so nothing glamorous, but just the idea that I was the one in charge of that operation made me feel like I'd reached a point. I felt like I've done all this study, I've trained, and now I am the person in charge of this person's care. And to go from beginning to end, from assessing that person in the emergency department to performing the operation and then following them up, felt really rewarding that I was there continuously for their entire care from the start to the end. So it was a great feeling, and I still remember that very first case.
Something that most people, when they go into a hospital, aren't so aware of is the hierarchy. The intense hierarchy was something that I found fascinating. Can you just talk me a little bit through that hierarchy and how it works?
Yeah, it's very, very rigid in medicine. So you go to medical school, so that's the start. You're a medical student and you are thrown into the hospital system from when you're a student because you have to gain the clinical exposure and skills to that. When you graduate, you become a doctor, and the first year you're an intern. And then you'd spend the next 1 or 2 years as a resident, and then you become a registrar.
And what's the difference between those three things?
There's not a huge amount of difference between an intern and a resident. They just call you an intern to start with, I guess, so that people know that you're fresh.
So it's not the same as like an intern that we might have here at Mamamia, because intern kind of makes it sound a little bit like work experience.
Yeah, it does sound a bit like that, doesn't it? No, you're fully qualified as a doctor when you're an intern, but you are still very green. Yeah. And then you're a resident and registrar. And once you are a registrar, you have to apply for various training programs depending on what you want to specialise in. So once you're accepted into that advanced training program, then you're an accredited registrar. So within that hierarchy, there are unaccredited and accredited registrars. So I was at the stage where I was an unaccredited registrar awaiting to get chosen onto the plastic surgery training program. So that's where I was at.
And why plastic surgery? Why did you want to be involved in that type of medicine?
I was fascinated from when I was younger. And just to give people the Grey's reference, that's McSteamy's specialty. So, facial reconstruction, burns, all of that kind of stuff. And I remember hearing a case when I was a student about a jaw reconstruction. So someone had a broken jaw and it got reconstructed using a rib. And I thought that was amazing that someone had seen the curvature of a rib and thought, yes, that approximates the curvature of a mandible. So we'll use that to reconstruct it.
Is a mandible a jawbone?
Yeah, the jawbone. And I thought that's so clever.
So it's quite creative, reconstructive surgery.
Exactly. And that's why I was interested, because I think I've always had a creative side to me. And this was the one specialty that I felt would satisfy both the left and right side of my brain. So both the creativity and the logical problem-solving side. So I was both intellectually very stimulated by the specialty, but I also liked that I can use my hands. I'm a mechanical learner, so the idea that I could make a career out of helping people with my two little hands was really appealing to me. So from the beginning, I knew I wanted to do surgery.
When you're training as a doctor and you're an intern and a resident, do you have to work in the public system?
Yes.
So what was the reaction of people when you came in to treat them as their doctor?
Well, initially I was very young. I was 23 when I qualified, so I had a lot of patients wonder whether I was old enough to be a doctor. And I remember deliberately wearing kind of older people clothes, I guess.
What were they? I had skinny jeans?
I've seen all your videos on the jeans, Mia. I am wearing mum jeans today.
Skinny jeans and a side part. Yeah. Older
I had like a jacket with elbow patches and I had thick-rimmed glasses to make myself look older and smarter because I knew that I looked young and people didn't think that I was competent because of how I looked. And later on, when I had more responsibility as a registrar, I knew that I had to come across like I knew what I was doing, but it was hard because not many people kind of picture a young woman as their surgeon. I guess the image of a surgeon is a tall white man. So, there's all these unconscious biases, and I don't blame people for being surprised when I treat them. But I did feel as though I was not what they were expecting. So often I'll have a chat with a patient. I'll do the whole consultation. I'll introduce myself as the doctor, assess them, describe the procedure, obtain their consent for surgery. And even after all of that, I'll have patients say, "Thank you, nurse. When do I get to see the doctor?" So I got mistaken a lot for either a medical student or a nurse. I still get it now. I've been a doctor for over 10 years now, and I still work as a doctor but in the private system now. And I still get people asking me whether I'm a nurse or a student.
How do you handle that?
It's hard. I mean, normally I just brush it off and I just say, "Oh no, I'm the doctor," or "I'm the registrar." But it does get tiring after a while to have to prove your competence because you're not what people expect. And I think the problem is that there's not a lot of visibility for women in surgery. In Australia, only 11% of surgeons are women, which is such a tiny number. And in certain specialties, it's even lower than that. For example, in orthopedics, it's only 4%.
When you talk about those statistics, only 11% of surgeons are women, you can listen to those statistics and go, well, that's not very many. How does that play out in the real world? I mean, you talk about we have an unconscious bias that it's always men, but what then is it like in your peer group to be only in that tiny minority of 11%? In a hospital, for example?
Yeah, I think that the lack of visibility lends itself to an environment of misogyny. When you think about the kind of crude jokes, sexist jokes that men like to throw around when they're just among the guys, it's like that because there's no one around to tell them that it's not appropriate.
There aren't enough women.
Yeah, exactly.
To be critical mass.
Yeah. If there's, 50% women and men, I don't think that they would get away with as much of what they say. So often in the operating theatre, I might be the only woman there and all these guys will be cracking jokes and it's all very blokey. It's very
much. What
much
kind of jokes will they be cracking?
Oh gosh, I remember I was playing some music in the operating theatre. It was Cyndi Lauper and a surgeon saying, "Oh, what is this music? I feel like I've walked into a tampon commercial." So they'll say things like that.
What about sexual harassment? Is that more prevalent because there aren't as many women around?
Yeah, you do feel targeted as a woman because, like you said, there's not that many of us and it's very common, especially in surgery.
Because it's not just the disparity between men and women. I imagine it's a lot of older men around a lot of younger women.
Yes.
So that there's even more of a power imbalance.
Yes.
How did you see that play out with you and some of the other women that you were with in hospitals?
It's so easy to feel exploited as a young woman because it's a very small world and so your direct bosses are the ones who will influence your career. And it's unlike other industries where you might be able to train through different providers. In medicine and surgery, there's only one college that you can apply to. So you've only got that one shot. So that's why there's a tremendous level of pressure to impress your bosses, and that's why young doctors and especially young women are very vulnerable.
I never realised that. So because if you say worked in marketing or you were an engineer, there's lots of different employers that you could go to.
Yeah, exactly. You can go to lots of different firms, but let's say you wanted to be a plastic surgeon. There is only one college of surgeons to apply to. There's only one training program in the whole of Australia. So there's no other place to apply if you stuff it up. So it's a lot of pressure.
Was the process of going from bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, keen as mustard medical student to burnt-out husk of a human who had to resign, was it a slow process of kind of like the rose-coloured glasses coming off and over those years? What are some of those moments that you can remember that really stood out in that process?
It definitely was a slow process. I had a great internship. I was excited to be a doctor. I was ready to start my career. I did all these extra courses to get points for my CV and work towards building a good application. And I wanted to be the best possible candidate for the training program. But I think that when I was a resident, I started to see some bullying and some of the more toxic behaviours in the workplace. And even some racism as well, not just from colleagues, but from patients as well.
What happened?
Oh, the worst one was when I went to help a patient and she saw me walk in and without me even saying anything, she said, "I'll have an Aussie, thanks." And
What did you say?
I didn't know how to cope with it. So I went and hid in a broom cupboard until I could calm down and walk back out again. I haven't experienced a huge amount of racism growing up. I grew up in Singapore, which is a very multicultural place. And, it's in Asia, so I wasn't a minority there. So I've spent some time in the UK and now in Australia. And it's only really coming to these sort of countries that I have felt it. And that moment really killed me because until that stage, I was always very confident in my skills and I knew that I would do a good job looking after patients. And that's the first time I felt rejected based on colour. And I honestly didn't know how to respond. And luckily for me, there was a nurse who had witnessed it who spoke to the patient and she got me back and said, "Look, I'm sorry about that happened, but I've spoken to the patient. Will you come back and treat the patient?" And it took a lot for me to go back there. I had to try and be as professional as possible, just see it as my job. I'm here to help a patient. Doesn't matter what she said, doesn't matter how I feel personally about that interaction. I'm just going to go back and treat her. And in the end, when she realised that I knew what I was doing, she was apologetic. But that was my first experience of racism in healthcare, and it definitely did affect how I felt about myself within the healthcare system for the years moving forward.
What about from people you worked with? Did you experience racism from them?
Not directly. Yeah, not directly. But again, I think there are a lot of unconscious biases, particularly when it comes to selection for these kind of higher positions. And
Tell me about that.
yeah, I think there's this docility myth that Asian people don't strive for leadership positions.
That you weren't hungry enough.
Yeah, yep. There's the bamboo ceiling that we talk about.
What's the bamboo ceiling?
The bamboo ceiling is like the glass ceiling but for Asian people. Yeah, so for me, I had both a bamboo and a glass ceiling. I had a hybrid ceiling to
So
try
many
and smash.
ceilings, Yumiko.
So many ceilings, yeah, and I couldn't break them. But yeah, the bamboo ceiling affects Asian people, both men and women, trying to go for leadership positions because there's this idea that we're, very timid culturally and that we're not interested in leadership roles. So I think it does affect Asian people trying to progress in their careers.
You mentioned that patient who was so incredibly rude and racist. I always imagine that patients are very grateful and polite because that would seem to be the most sensible thing to do to the person who's holding the scalpel or the needle or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Is that the case? What are some of the patients that you remember over the time that you were working?
There were lots of really lovely, grateful patients. I think there was a mixture, really. I think that in Australia, we're very lucky that we've got a Medicare system. It's all taxpayer funded. And so I think that when you receive something for free, you're not as appreciative of it.
Yeah.
You don't know the value of something unless you
Yeah.
have to pay for it, right? So a lot of people, I think, experience less gratefulness in the public system compared to the private. But there were plenty of really beautiful interactions with patients and their families that made me feel valued and that I was doing something good for others. And really, that's the only thing that kept me going right at the end when I was so burnt out and feeling so disillusioned by everything. There was one particular patient who I saw every single morning on my ward round, and he was the one who kept me going. He was the one I woke up for every morning, knowing that I would go there, greet him, and he would always be very grateful for me looking after him. And so those are the ones that I really cherished over the years, making me feel like I was doing something worthwhile.
Tell me about the relationship between doctors and nurses. What's that dynamic like?
Overall, I've had a positive experience. I'm still very good friends with the nurses that I've made over the years, but it certainly was hard when I first started out because when you're an intern, you kind of have to prove yourself. And I think that quite rightly, nurses are cynical of the new ones because, we don't know what we're doing yet. So it can take a while to gain the trust of nurses. And sometimes I did find it difficult as a woman. It's mainly female nurses in the hospital. And I did find that it seemed to be a lot easier for men, especially if they were good looking, to get what they wanted. So if they wanted something done on the wards, it was sometimes you would see nurses almost fighting over helping the hot intern. And there I was struggling to get my jobs done because no one wanted to help me. I mean, classic example, when I was a registrar, I was working with a very good-looking fellow registrar. When he went to the emergency department wanting a trolley set up with all this dressing equipment to attend to a wound, the nurses were very helpful, set everything up for him, got all the equipment, everything he needed was right there ready for him. But when I went back for a similar sort of thing, the nurse said, well, you can go to the back of the room. That's where the storeroom is. Help yourself. So I did find that sometimes the treatment was different. Yeah.
Are there many relationships at work? I imagine with working such long hours and in such a high pressure environment, are you allowed to have relationships with other people that work in the hospital?
You are allowed, and there are a lot of relationships in the hospital. There are a lot of male doctors married to female nurses. That's very common. And I myself did date another doctor while I was in the hospital as well. I think that it's frowned upon when it's just like any other industry. If it's your direct boss, you shouldn't date them.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's a huge hospital.
Like in Grey's Anatomy.
Like in Grey's Anatomy.
Meredith and Derek.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Should never have happened, technically.
No, I don't think so. But they didn't know, though. They were strangers when they met in that bar, so I guess that was okay. Yeah, but that was awkward when they ended up working together.
Very awkward. And do you remember the first patient that you lost?
You know, I do. It was a man in a car accident. He had a cardiac condition that made him lose consciousness, and he crashed his truck, and he was brought into the emergency department, and I was working as a surgical registrar at the time, so I was looking after all the traumas coming in, and we performed CPR for a very long time, and we eventually got his heart back, but he ended up dying in the ICU a few days later, so I do remember that. I don't think you ever forget something like that.
How do you break hard news to patients about maybe test results or operations haven't gone well?
It's never easy, but there are definitely ways we're taught to do this. First of all, you have to respect the privacy of the patient. So you're not going to do it in a cubicle with some curtains that people can hear through. You'll find a quiet, private room to do it. And you often have more than one person from the treating team there. So you might have like a nurse there as a witness so that, you know, just in case the conversation doesn't go well, there's somebody else there as a mediator.
Do you mean if someone accuses you of maybe causing a problem or...
Yeah, or if things get a little bit heated.
Has that happened to you before?
Yeah, sometimes when, complications happen, family members can get very angry. Sometimes it's hard for patients to speak up, and it's often the family members who are more vocal and passionate about their care. So you can sometimes get angry at family members. So it is helpful to have a witness there. And also someone who's advocating for the patient as well. So often a nurse is that perfect in-between person because they're part of the medical treating team, but they're also a patient advocate because the nurse is the person who spends the most time on the ward looking after these patients. So they're there to vouch for the patient and make sure the patient is heard as well. And there are also patient advocates as a separate role in the hospital as well. So there are often a few different people from the medical side as well as the patient and their important inner circle, whether it's a best friend or next of kin or family member. So it's often a group setting that we deliver bad news. So the patient also has a support person there as well. I think it's about being honest. Even if it's bad news, I don't think you should ever sugarcoat bad news.
What are some of the things you've had to tell people in that kind of situation?
I think the hardest is always something like cancer coming back. I have had to do that a couple of times. I remember a patient who had surgery which was meant to be curative, but it was such an aggressive cancer and there must have been a tiny amount left behind at the initial surgery, and it came back very aggressively, and he had a very poor prognosis when that came back. So delivering that kind of news is always really hard. Even if it's in a group setting, even if you're not the one directly telling the patient, it's really hard to be part of that conversation. You do feel a little bit of guilt. You feel very empathetic and terrible for the patient because it's changed their life and what they were expecting for the years ahead. So, yeah, it gets pretty heavy.
I imagine there's part of you that has to get quite hardened to that. How do you become hardened so that you don't let that then destroy your day, your week, your mind, while still staying compassionate and human?
It's such a hard balance. I think I probably did become a little bit more desensitized over the years, but I never lost my empathy, and sometimes I felt a little bit unprofessional when I got a little bit teary or emotional with a patient. But what I've learned is that patients actually appreciate that. They want a doctor who cares and is human, because it is horrible if you find out that you've got a terminal illness or you've got a terrible injury that's going to affect your daily function. So I think it's something that we should be encouraging health professionals to do. I think that it is also important for health professionals to learn how to debrief after that kind of thing and not bring it home, because it's so easy to continue thinking about these hard things when you get home, and you don't always have the opportunity to debrief about it with your colleagues. So,
is there a formal process?
No, there often isn't. Yeah, it's just whether you've got a supportive boss who is willing to have those conversations with you. So you kind of have to be proactive if you have gone through something really terrible or traumatizing at work. And you often do, especially if you work in some place like emergency or intensive care, where you see some of the sickest patients. It is important to talk about it and to process that. Sometimes if it's a really terrible accident, for example, when I was working in the children's hospital, a car ploughed into a classroom and killed some children, and the children arrived dead. They were dead on arrival at the emergency department. So if something really catastrophic like that happens, then the hospital will provide counselling for the staff that were working on that day.
What was that day like?
It was really awful because it was multiple children, and I saw their parents as well.
Oh my God. Do they call ahead and say, we've got this situation?
Yeah, you get the call from the paramedics that these children are coming over. So you do get a heads up, but you can never prepare yourself for what you're going to see. It has to be something like that for the hospital to actually go, okay, let's provide some formal counselling. For other incidents, you don't always get that support. So you have to kind of look after yourself and go, okay, that was a really hard thing that I had to do at work. I should probably talk to somebody about that. And I want to normalize that, because it's normal to need therapy or to talk to somebody after you see something traumatic or you've gone through something difficult at work. But I think but it's not a common conversation in healthcare. Somehow we're meant to be tough and just get on with it. Mental illness especially is very stigmatized among the medical profession, which is...
Really?
It is. Isn't that ironic?
That's astonishing to me.
It is. I'm still struggling with that, that so many doctors look at colleagues with mental illness and judge them, because we've all studied psychiatry in medical school. We all know the science behind it. We have treated many patients with mental illness, and we have so much understanding and so much care for those patients, and yet when it's a colleague, somehow it's different. There was a big study by Beyond Blue among doctors, and it showed that 50% of doctors feel that if a colleague had a mental illness, then it should affect their career progression.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's still a lot of work to be done to change that culture. That's probably why I didn't accept my own mental health for the longest time, because I'd been kind of, socialized to believe that even though we are okay with patients with mental illness, somehow it's a personality thing or a weakness or a flaw if you've got a mental health illness. So I rejected my diagnosis for a really long time.
How would you sort of chart the deterioration of your mental health over the time that you worked in hospitals?
I really had a mental illness until right at the end. And I think I chose to ignore a lot of the signs because I kind of had to. I had to protect myself and keep going. So if I had accepted the diagnosis, then I don't think I would have been able to continue what I was doing. But I was good at ignoring the mental signs.
What were those signs?
I was physically exhausted, I was stressed, and I think one of the early signs is cynicism. So one of the signs of burnout is feeling more cynical or losing your empathy. And I think that I was growing more and more cynical over the weeks, but I didn't really pay too much attention to it. It's only now that I look back that I can see how my thinking was changing during that time. And I had really terrible insomnia, but that was normal for someone doing a 24-hour shift. I was on call, getting woken up in the middle of the night, getting lots of phone calls throughout the night. And so disrupted sleep was kind of part of the job. But it's only after I quit and realized that I couldn't sleep that I realized that was one of the major symptoms of depression. And you also have this kind of diminished sense of accomplishment. You think, what am I doing? You kind of lose your sense of purpose. And I did feel like that during my final term. I just didn't know what I was doing it for anymore. But really, the only thing that made me stop was when my physical health suffered. And that's when I had my bowel accident on the way to work. I was driving and I completely lost fecal continence. I literally shut myself.
Wow.
And that was such an all-time low for me. That was the warning sign. Until that point, I had chosen to ignore my stress, but that's when I realized I couldn't keep ignoring it anymore, when my basic bodily functions weren't even working anymore.
Your body spoke up pretty loudly.
It sure did.
You couldn't ignore it. So when did you know it was time to check in to a mental hospital?
I knew I was really unwell because my apartment looked like a hoarder's apartment. There were just old clothes everywhere. I wasn't looking after myself. Sometimes I wouldn't change my clothes or shower for 3 days, and there were dirty piles of dishes in the sink. And I've always been a very organised person, so to see myself in that condition was quite horrifying. And I remember taking photos of my apartment and sending it to my psychiatrist saying, this is how I'm living. I'm living in squalor. I can't look after myself anymore. I'm not sleeping. I'm not eating well. I didn't have the energy to even go to the shops to do a proper grocery run, so I was just surviving on cereal. And I just knew that that wasn't normal.
Did you get a diagnosis?
I did. I was diagnosed with depression. This was about a week after quitting my job, and we trialed lots of different medications. Nothing was really happening. It was really a good few months before I deteriorated to the point where I needed to go to hospital, but I just kept getting worse and worse. Yes, I was in there for 6 weeks in the end.
Who made the call that you had to go to hospital?
It was initially recommended by my psychiatrist, and I didn't want to go because I didn't want to bump into someone I knew. I didn't want a colleague to go, oh, what's she doing in hospital? I didn't want them to think I was crazy.
You felt stigma.
I did feel so much stigma, and I knew that being a doctor that I would inevitably, it's such a small world, bump into someone who might know me and might spread gossip about me being in a psychiatric facility. So I really pushed back on that. But after my psychiatrist recommended it, I did think about it for a couple of weeks, and I thought, you know what, she's right. I do need the help. And so I went in for a voluntary admission after that.
And so once you were released, over the past few years, it's been a slow climb back?
It has, yeah. And now I'm on the right medication now. It's amazing what being on the right medication can do. I used to never even want to take Panadol for pain. So I was always I know it's funny because I'm a doctor, but I never wanted to take medications unless I really, really needed it. But now I've accepted that if that's what I need to function, then that's what I need. And so I'm a bit kinder to myself now and less judgmental of myself. And I really have medications to thank for helping me sleep again. Because I remember when I went on to that last medication change, I could suddenly sleep again. So that also was a good thing for me because it just shows how biological depression can be. Suddenly, with the right medication, it was affecting the correct neurotransmitters that needed correcting in my brain. And so that sudden switch told me that, you know what, there is a neurobiological process going on. So
You're a doctor. You should have known that.
I should have known that, but it kind of proved it to me. I'm like, yeah, okay, I accept it.
Yeah, it's like, what do they say about doctors making the worst patients sometimes?
We are definitely the absolutely worst patients.
Tell me about the hours, because that sort of underpins your whole story and the story of the medical system or the hospital system and what led to your lowest point.
Yeah, it was definitely the hours that ultimately broke me. I was working 12 days in a row and then 2 off, 12 on, 2 off consecutively. Every single fortnight was like that. And 10 of those 12 days were 24-hour shifts.
How is that even legal?
I don't
Let
know.
alone, you know, like they say, don't take this headache tablet if you're operating heavy machinery.
That's right, yeah.
Like operating on humans and have people's lives in your hands and are making decisions like that, how does that happen?
It's just so unsafe to do that. And that roster had existed for a very long time, even before I had done that job. I guess the difference was that some of the people who had done the job before me hadn't done the same amount of years as me. So I was 8th year out. So I was considered a bit more senior and I could do a lot of operations on my own. So I would be left to do operations late at night, sometimes even at 3 o'clock in the morning, and on weekends on my own. So I didn't have a lot of senior support, whereas other people who'd worked before me could leave at a more reasonable time, partly because they had a more supportive senior registrar working with them who could relieve them. But also, if you can't do the operation, then a boss has to come in. And they don't want to come in the middle of the night, so they'll schedule it for a more reasonable time. And they have, I guess, negotiating power with the operating theatre. What I learned is that it's not always about clinical urgency. A lot of it's political when it comes to operations. And so I never had that backing. So I was there on my own. They would easily just push me to the back of the list, and non-urgent cases that were, less urgent than mine would get done before me because it was just easy to put me at the back of the line because I had no power.
You just had all the responsibility, none of the power.
Exactly. So it was like that.
Is that because you're a woman or because you didn't complain?
Maybe partly that, and maybe because I was there on my own as a registrar, but other surgical specialties had consultants there. So they had more senior support and more important people who could push for their cases to get done first. So it was a daily battle to try and get operations done, especially in such an under-resourced hospital where there's not enough operating time, not enough staff to run all these theatres to get all these emergencies done.
Yumiko, why aren't there enough staff? Why are the hours so crazy?
I guess everyone always brings it down to funding. Not enough funding, not enough staff there.
So there aren't enough people coming out of medical school, or that's not the problem?
No, I don't think it's the doctors necessarily. Sometimes, operating theatres require lots of different people. You need nurses, you need scrub nurses who do the operation with you, who hand over the instruments, get everything ready. There are scout nurses who go and get the equipment during the operation, anaesthetic nurses, and then porters who come in, do the manual handling of the patient before and after each operation. So one operation requires a huge team of people. So there's lots of different employment issues, I guess, when it comes to trying to run an operating theatre. It's not just about the number of doctors, because actually we've got maybe too many doctors. We had this huge medical student tsunami a few years ago.
Because of Grey's Anatomy, probably.
Probably. I mean, sometimes there aren't enough jobs and you have unemployed doctors. So you have this group of highly trained individuals who don't have a job.
So the system is clearly very, very broken.
It is, yeah.
Why don't more people talk about it? You did your blog post when you left medicine. Did you raise these concerns with your superiors, with administrators?
It's hard to speak up while you're still in it. I had nothing to lose because I'd already chosen to leave the public system. I was done. I knew I was never going to go back there. But while you're still in it, it's very difficult to say anything, especially if you haven't been chosen onto this training program yet. Because if you speak up, you're seen as a troublemaker.
You'd be blacklisted.
Exactly. So it's really hard for anyone to say anything. And there's this kind of professional code of secrecy. You don't say anything bad to make the profession or the hospital look bad. It's just an expectation that you do your job and you don't complain about it. But I'm glad that I have now, because I know that this experience that I've been through is not unique. A lot of people go through this, and one of the good things about having written the book is that it's validated my experience, because lots of readers who are doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals have gotten in touch and said, yep.
Me too.
Yeah,
Me
exactly.
too.
It's exactly what it's like. And so I think that by sharing stories, we can validate each other's experiences, because what happens is that hospitals and other employers like to gaslight their employees. They make you feel like you're the one who couldn't cope, you're the crazy one, or you're the incompetent one. So for a long time, when people leave these jobs, they feel like they did something wrong. But really, there's so many systemic factors that are driving people out. And I think what I really want is for institutions to take more responsibility and show more leadership in fixing.
What should change? What would you change?
Oh, there's so many things that need to be changed culturally, which takes time. Culture is so hard to change. But a simple thing that is more tangible is actually having the correct numbers, having the correct number of employees, making sure that the shifts that you're rostered on for are reasonable and safe, both for the doctors and the patients. Because like I said before, you don't want someone operating on heavy machinery if they are
I don't want anyone
tired.
operating on me at 3 a.m.
Yeah, exactly. If somebody is cutting your body open, you want that person to be well rested.
So well rested.
Yeah.
I want them to have just come back from like a long holiday.
And really alert and
Yeah.
ready to do the best possible job that they can. So it's unbelievable that these surgeons are expected to operate on patients when they're so tired. And I mean, I always draw parallels with driving. Fatigue is one of the biggest killers on the roads. If you're not safe enough to drive a car, you are not safe enough to operate
Cut open
on
a person.
Yeah, and I spoke about crashing my car. It's actually very common among doctors who do on-call work. Almost every doctor I know who does on-call work has at some point crashed their car while they've been on call, because that's how tired we are. So I think that's a huge red flag.
The reddest of red flags. And there was a real sense when you were writing about how the doctors would say, oh, it'll be good for you. I did it. And look how I turned out.
Exactly.
Is that not just the worst excuse
It's
anyone
terrible.
could make?
Survivorship bias in medicine, where we only listen to the survivors. The people who stay think, well, if I can get through it, anybody else can get through it. There's nothing wrong if I'm still here, kind of thing. No one ever talks to the people who leave. And they're the people that we should be talking to, because we need to find out why they left. What happened to you? Why have you given up your career? Why have you chosen not to be a doctor anymore? But no one reaches out to those people. And to be honest, those people probably never want to talk to anyone at the hospital ever again after their experience, because a lot of people who have left because they've been bullied or sexually harassed or assaulted. Terrible things happen to doctors and nurses, and no one really talks to them.
There was an older doctor who sexually harassed you, who went on to be charged. Can you tell me that story?
Yeah, I was only 19 when I was sexually assaulted. I was a medical student, and he was a professor, the head of a unit at an oncology centre. And it was such a huge betrayal, because he was someone I looked up to. He was a wonderful teacher, an excellent clinician, someone that I looked up to.
Trusted.
And trusted. And he had completely exploited my vulnerability, because I had told him that I was finding my oncology term difficult because I had lost my godmother to cancer. And so it was quite triggering to be working in a cancer centre and seeing these patients coming in for chemo. And so I had a lot of unprocessed grief about that. And his registrar actually recommended that I talk to him because he had some qualification in counselling. So that's how it all started. He started giving me counselling, and initially I was very grateful that someone so important was caring about my well-being at work and wanting to help me overcome this grief so that I could finish my term, because it was a very emotionally difficult term for me to do. But, he was definitely grooming me. He was asking me questions about my father and past relationships. I think he was trying to see how far he could push my boundaries. And
Under the guise of counselling you.
Yeah. There were some very personal questions and I thought, oh, this is a bit strange, but I trust him. He's a professional. He's there to help me. And so these personal questions are only for him to counsel me. But eventually during one of these counselling sessions, he started touching me inappropriately on my chest and putting his hands underneath my blouse. And it was a horrible experience. Like, you feel so dirty when that happens. And I was just so shocked that someone like him, he was a very gentle-natured person, could do that. The university have actually since contacted me since the book has come out to apologise for not doing better.
Did you report him at the time?
I spoke to a staff member, an academic who was in charge of student wellbeing, and she kind of left it up to me whether I wanted to make a formal report or not. And for all the reasons I said before, it's very difficult to complain. So I chose not to make a big fuss about it. I just said, I just want the clinical school to be aware of it, but I won't make a formal complaint. But I really didn't want him to do that to other students. So I wanted them to know without officially lodging a complaint. But I've since spoken about this to a few friends of mine who are now consultants. And even though I don't really blame the uni or the person that I spoke to, they said, you know what, imagine if a 19-year-old came to you now as a senior doctor and said, this is what happened, what would you do? And we all agreed that we wouldn't leave it up to that young girl to make that decision. We should fully support a formal complaint. It should be mandatory to report that kind of thing and to make that person feel like if they were to go ahead with the report that they would be fully supported and would be believed. I was like, well, no one's going to believe me. He's a professor. He's a professor.
And you were just starting out in your career.
Exactly. Who is this troublemaker? This very eminent professor, very respected in his field, powerful guy. How would anyone ever take my side? I didn't feel like I was supported in making that report. So I hope that now, if a medical student were to tell an academic or anyone at the university or the hospital that something like this happened, that they would take it more seriously and not leave it up to the victim.
What ended up happening to him?
He ended up doing it to other women. And about 10 years after the incident that happened to me, he went to jail. And I only found out about it when I was looking at a newspaper one day and I was horrified. I thought, oh my God, I know who that is. He had drugged and molested one of his registrars. He gave her benzos, so she was sedated, and she woke up to him sucking on her nipple. It was such a horrible thing. And, I don't know her personally, but from what I've heard within the profession, she wasn't able to get a job again here in New South Wales, so she's gone interstate. And
so she was the one who ended up stigmatised in the medical world
and this
after being a victim of sexual assault.
Yeah, correct. This is what always happens. I also talk about another surgeon in the book called Caroline Tan in Melbourne. She made a report about her supervisor. She even brought it to the Victorian Tribunal and she won. And she, again, is the one being punished because she has not been able to get a job in the public hospital system in Victoria. So
wow, that's breathtaking.
Yeah, it's disgusting, isn't it? Like there's so much victim blaming and victim shaming when it comes to sexual harassment and sexual assault within the medical profession.
Is that because the gatekeepers are a small group of men?
Oh, yeah. When you look at all these selection panels onto training programs, it's all men. You're sitting there opposite a table of men sitting there and deciding your future.
Yumiko, what does life look like now, 3 years out from resigning?
Thankfully, nothing like that. I can sleep again, which is amazing. I suffered from insomnia for 18 months after I quit, and it's a really awful thing to not be able to sleep. But now I can sleep again. My mental health is so much better. I have a more balanced life now. I've taken my power back because now I feel like a bit of a freelancer in that I get to choose my hours and who I work with. So I'm lucky enough that I can still practice medicine, and I work with 2 lovely plastic and reconstructive surgeons who basically take me along to all of their operating lists. So I am their number 2, their assistant surgeon. And I think part of my recovery was accepting that it's okay to not have followed through with what I originally planned for myself. Also, just to put my ego in check. I always liked being the leader, but I'm actually okay being an assistant surgeon. I'm okay playing second fiddle. It still allows me to use my skills that I've gained over the years. But I get to do it in a much more civilized, pleasant environment. So a couple of days a week, I'll go to the operating theatre and operate with the surgeons, and they have the same team of nurses every time. So it's really nice. We all know each other. We all love each other. So it's like going to work with friends and family. I found a joy in surgery again, so I'm very grateful for that. And I've got all this extra time now to do the things I like reading and exercise and having a life, having a social life again. So life is definitely a lot more balanced now.
If you're not a doctor or you've never been involved in the health system as an insider, a lot of what you just heard will come as a shock to you. I had absolutely no idea it was like that. I mean, I watched ER, I watched Grey's Anatomy, but it just makes no sense that these people who have to make these life and death decisions are expected to work these insane hours. I mean, there are laws against those kind of hours for like truck drivers and other kinds of workers, people who don't have other people's lives in their hands. Literally, they have other people's lives in their hands. Oh, I just learnt so much. Based on that initial viral post that she wrote, Yumiko was approached to write a book. It is out. It is a bestseller. It's a memoir of her time as a doctor, and it's called Emotional Female. It's a really great read. We will pop a link in the show notes, and you can also follow Yumiko on Instagram. Her handle is @mindbodymiko. No Filter is produced by Lucy Neville. The executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, and I'm Mia Friedman. I'll see you on the Mamamia app.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.